Hi everyone, my name is Sabi Hinkson. I am a graduate student at McGill University, and the title of my research is Working Towards Increasing the Representation of Blacks in STEM, one equitable classroom at a time. So the overview of my presentation is as follows. I will present some background information. I will present my research question along with my theoretical framework, methodology, and method. I will summarize my findings and then discuss possible future work for myself. So I thought it was important to basically introduce to you who I am, because I think every aspect of who I am really influences how I approach my profession and my research. So I'm the mother of two daughters. I'm a STEM educator. I am an advocate for EDI work. I am very passionate about helping others in my community, especially the Black community. And I'm a student. I am a lifelong learner. I love going to school. I am just finishing up my degree, my master's in teaching and learning science and technology at McGill. I'm also going to be wrapping up a master's in theology from Concordia University. And my hopes are to return to McGill to start a PhD in the near future. So what put me on this research path is that when I started this degree, it was in the height of the George Floyd tragedy. So a lot of my professors were presenting articles and information about the systemic racism that's embedded within the education system. And they really started highlighting how toxic the STEM terrain is for marginalized individuals, such as Blacks. So I hadn't thought about my experience as being um, a as being such a negative one. I thought it was pretty much okay. I was always the only Black girl, which made me feel special. And then as I started reflecting upon my experience more, because of what was going on, I started realizing that things weren't as positive as I thought they were. So the research question that I decided to work on is, what can the underrepresentation of Blacks in STEM suggest to us about the STEM pipeline, and how can I use this knowledge to help change the narrative? So when I say STEM pipeline, I'm just referring to that progression from post-secondary studies to STEM professional. So the theoretical framework that I decided to use was critical race theory. I thought it was very fitting for what I was trying to look at. I live in Quebec, where our premier says that systemic racism it doesn't exist in Quebec. And CRT says that systemic racism is real and allows you to question and challenge the very systems that we have in society that have racism embedded in them and therefore perpetuate racism. So the basic tenets of CRT can be found at very many places. I took them from the Delgado's book. The ideas are as follows. Race is socially constructed. Racism is just ordinary. It's become such a part of our everyday life and society that it's not deemed as out of the ordinary. These two tenets here basically show that racism serves the interests or the needs of whites. There's a discussion of intersectionality, which understands that everyone, like one person, doesn't just belong to one group. As for me, for example, I'm a Black female, so there's two ideas there, gender and race involved. And the idea of voice of color is just basically that visible minorities, because of their common histories and experiences with oppression, it gives them competence to speak on issues about race and racism, even if it's not about their group. So the methodology that I decided to use for myself was not because I was reflecting on my experiences, but also looking at them against the systems that I was involved in. I thought that critical autoethnography was very important for me to do, because it really allows you to look at your personal experiences and analyze the injustices that may have influenced your experiences, and just it was really appropriate for my research. So for my method, I just basically had to journal and self-reflect, reflect upon my experiences from secondary school all the way up to my STEM professional life, to basically take a look at what my experiences truly were. That was my data. I then analyzed my data and looked for salient themes. And a lot of the themes I saw overlap with my literature review. And then after that, I used my data and analyzed it with a CRT lens from a Black perspective. So from the literature review, it became very apparent that this area of research is very underdeveloped in Canada. There's a lot of discussion about the underrepresentation of Blacks in STEM in the US, but not so much in Canada. There are two main issues, which I will further discuss later. But the first issue is that Blacks are not even entering the STEM pipeline, which would suggest that these problems are starting as early as the youth sector. And then Blacks are not staying in the STEM pipeline, so there are retention issues. And then a lot of literature shows how toxic the STEM terrain is, and that because of its toxicity, there are a lot of negative effects on Black students. So after analyzing my STEM journey critically, these are some things that I came up with that I realized were a part of my experience. So as I was subjected to institutional microaggressions. So these are defined as racially marginalizing actions and inertia of the university, which are evidenced in structures, practices, and discourses that endorse a campus racial climate hostile to people of color. So the institutional microaggressions that I am aware of are: one, all my professors were white males. Blacks did not appear in any of the advertisements for science in the science pavilion, sorry. And none of the literature that we were being presented had any Black scientists or any Black STEM professionals. So I also realized upon reflecting was that I constantly tried my best to fit in. So I didn't look the part of a traditional scientist. I was not a thin white male, but I tried my best to go under the radar. So because I was a thick, Black, curvy woman, I decided to buy male lab coats because they were less form-fitting and they could hide my curves. My hair is curly. So I decided that in order to avoid those microaggressions of people asking me, oh, can I touch your hair? And just to look the part more, I started wearing straight weaves. And I was constantly code switching and just switching up the way that I act, even that I acted at school or work, even my mannerisms and the way I spoke. My daughter said, I can always tell when you're talking to your school friends because you sound white, mom. So I really suffered a loss of identity. So when I wasn't reminding myself that I didn't belong, my white peers were doing a very good job at that. I never forget this experience. Was the first experience of this was I was going to my CJEP orientation for advanced peer and applied science. And I walked in and a white female said to me, well, social science is down the hall. I didn't understand why she was saying this to me. So I asked her, is this advanced peer and applied science? And she said, yes. And I sat down and she was very perplexed and very puzzled. As I looked around, I realized why she was startled. I was the only Black person in this entire orientation. And from that moment on, I realized that I didn't belong. There were also some negative stereotypes of Blacks that really influenced how I behaved in school. There's this idea that Black people are always late. And I was a very punctual person and I liked being early. However, I did have 2 children by the end of this degree. So sometimes I could not get out of the house on time. So even if I was going to be a few minutes late for class, I would choose to just skip the class and to avoid the walk of shame of walking in there late and people saying, well, of course the Black girl's late. So imagine I would rob myself of two hours of subject material and learning just because I didn't want to live up to this stereotype. The institutional microaggressions reminded me that Blacks don't do science. And this, of course, put so much pressure on me to prove that I did belong there and that I was good enough to be a scientist. And this made me develop test anxiety. And I wasn't performing well on my test because of this test anxiety. And I started realizing that this was perhaps a product of stereotype threat. And I'm now realizing that. And stereotype threat is the idea that groups who are often targets of negative stereotypes feel extra pressure to not fail. And this pressure ultimately causes them to perform less well. And this contributes to the gap in performance between minorities and whites. So I also, at the end of my biochemistry degree, I had racked up a whole bunch of health issues, and a lot of them, my physicians weren't sure why I was developing them. As I delved into my literature review, I came across these ideas of weathering and racial battle fatigue that made me think that perhaps these are the reasons why I developed health issues. So weathering and racial battle fatigue are relatively similar. So weathering is the idea that Blacks experience unfavorable health conditions in comparison to whites as a result of chronic exposure to social and economic disadvantages, whereas racial battle fatigue is described as the psychological, physiological, and behavioral effects and the relationships among these effects that are associated with racial, ethnic minorities' experiences fighting racial microaggressions. So what did I realize from this critical autoethnography? So from my research and my self-analysis, I realized that navigating the STEM terrain without the awareness of its toxicity towards Blacks reduced my self-confidence, caused me to lack self-efficacy, and hindered me from developing a strong attachment to the field of STEM. So because I wasn't aware that there was a problem with the actual system, I thought the problem was me. And I wished someone would have told me about these issues and the systemic racism that was embedded in the STEM terrain, because maybe I would have pushed on a little bit harder and not been so hard on myself. And I would have realized that you are cut out for science. It's just the fault of the system. So despite these negative things that I discussed, I thought to myself, but why did I stay? What made me stay long enough to actually get a degree in science? And I realized that I was a part of science college at Concordia University, which is a minor in scientific research. And because of this, I was required to do research projects every semester in different labs. And it was really these research projects that made me develop a STEM identity and made me realize that I can do science because I'm actually doing science. So I felt like a scientist. In addition to that, the director of Science College was a Black woman, and she always cheered for me, advocated for me, and she genuinely cared for me. She would ask me, what did you eat? How are the kids? Why do you look sad? So just having that Black figure at school who actually genuinely cared for me made me feel like I was included and like I was important. So what else can be done to help increase the representation of Blacks in STEM? So as I mentioned, the research opportunities and having that Black role model, that worked for me, but what else can be done? So I'll just remind you of some of the reasons why there's an underrepresentation of Blacks in STEM. So the Blacks are not entering the STEM pipeline. This is probably happening at the youth sector level, especially high school, because Black youths are being streamed and groomed. They're often steered away from the advanced math and science courses that they need to take, or they're often groomed and told, you know what, you're really great with your hands. Maybe you should do a trade or something. So they're steered away from the STEM pipeline. We also see studies that show that Black youths, especially males, are subjected to harsher disciplinary measures in comparison to their white counterparts. So if they're being harshly disciplined and then which possibly results in them not liking school, they're definitely not going to take the quote unquote harder route to the STEM pipeline. Black youths are often labeled, whether it be labeled as special needs because their educators simply don't understand them, or troublemakers because, again, they're not understood. That also steers them away from obtaining prerequisites required to go into STEM. And of course, lack of Black representation in STEM is a big problem because they're not seeing themselves in STEM professionals. So that sends them the message that this is not for you. Now, why Blacks are dropping out of the STEM pipeline, it's basically because the STEM terrain is so littered with multiple different forms of racism. It makes it uncomfortable for Blacks. And if they are uncomfortable, then they're not attached, they're not developing a strong attachment to STEM, nor are they able to develop a STEM identity because of, lack of representation and just feeling uncomfortable. And if you do not have a strong STEM identity or a strong attachment to the STEM terrain, as soon as the pressures become too much and the stress becomes too much, it becomes very easy for you to detach yourself from STEM and drop out. And of course, lack of mental wellness support is a big problem, because if you're going through this toxic terrain, you definitely need mental wellness support. So in terms of suggestions for educators and academic institutions, these are Band-Aid approaches, of course, because the ultimate thing that we would like to do is dismantle these very systems that perpetuate racism. So systemic racism needs to be addressed. But until then, what can we do as educators? Of course, we need to have equitable institutions, and we need to have equitable approaches in our classrooms. So it's not enough for teachers to just care about all their students the same way. We need to have what Noddings calls transformative caring. This is the sort of equitable or empathetic approach to caring where you really try to get to know your students, because it's only when you know them, you will be able to know what they need. Administration really needs to push faculty and staff to critically reflect and see if they have implicit biases. A lot of us have implicit biases, and if you do have implicit biases to a certain group of people, that would perhaps prevent you from connecting with your students, and which would hinder you from caring for them in the right way. Sorry. So teachers must also adopt culturally responsive or relevant pedagogical approaches. Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about this. So CRP really says that your students are all competent, they come with useful prior knowledge, and they're able to understand the content. And it's up to you to be able to bridge that gap between who they are and the subject matter. And of course, increased representation of Blacks, whether it be in educators, in the student body, or even in the publications that you're exposing students to. If they see Black STEM professionals, they know that this is possible for them. And of course, same race role models are very important as well. And like I mentioned before, mental wellness support will definitely go a long way. So will my EDI work end here? Absolutely not. Why not? Because the work has just begun. We have so much work to do in terms of having equitable education systems, especially for Blacks here in Quebec. And I will share with you what I mean by that. So as I mentioned before, we live in Quebec, where our premier says that systemic racism doesn't exist. So we actually have to demonstrate that it does exist. And if something is not being acknowledged and people don't think that it's really a thing, then how can we work towards getting rid of it? I'm going to share with you some other headlines that describe things that are happening in Anglophone schools in Montreal. So our Black youths are going to school in schools that are basically excluding them and basically telling them they won't amount to much. So we have a lot of work to do. There is a lot of racism, and people think that racism is an American problem, and that's not a Canadian thing. Canadians are so nice, but this is just living proof that we have work to do over here as well. Just last week, a student came to me and said, a Black student in secondary 4, Ms. Hinkson, I really want to be an engineer, but I hate math and science. No matter what I do, I can't get good grades. So he has a passion for STEM, but he's not doing well in math and science because his teacher hasn't figured out a way to make it relevant and allow him to grasp it. So he's not feeling like he can achieve his dreams, and we have to do something about this. So my future work, I'm going to continue my EDI work and research and focus on the experience of other Black Canadians in STEM, especially the youths in Quebec. So my current research really looked at my experiences in STEM because I thought it was valuable to understand my experiences so that I can better help others. And now I will switch the focus to the experience of others. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and I would like to especially thank the Canadian Black Scientists Network for putting together this amazing initiative and allowing me to be a part of it. If you have any questions, concerns, suggestions, these are my email addresses, and these are my references. Thank you and have a great day and enjoy the rest of the conference.